So I'll get going. So I suppose we're delighted to be here. Dr. Susan McDonnell, I'm Dr. Maire, Hanniffy and Sinéad. Barrins, we have been, I suppose, kind of part of the process. Susan and I have been part of the project and we've been sharing it with our colleagues, and we're delighted that Sinéad is also on board with us. And we're going to just have a run through basically of some of the practices that we have been engaging with, and I suppose a focus on our discipline as well, which is something that Naomi alluded to, in that sometimes that element is often absent, and because ours is an arts programme, which no concrete job after it, that can be something that we're challenged with and something that we've engaged with in thinking about our assessment processes. So there's 4 components to our presentation. First, we're going to have a very brief overview of kind of authentic assessment and our thinking behind it with regard to our programme. Then I'm going to focus on feedback practices, so authentic feedback practices with a focus on one particular assignment. Then Sinead's going to take over and look at a community profile assessment, and then Susan's going to take over and look at the sustainable campus mapping assessment. So a nice little flavour of all of the different things that we are doing, and I suppose we'll welcome any feedback and obviously any compliments as well. We're very open to that. So again, I won't labour on this because Naomi has gone through a lot of it, but we're looking at very much embedding this idea of authentic assessment. And nearly, I suppose, we developed our programme, started 2017, was it? And even within that, maybe not having the lingo or the terminology back then, we very much thought about doing this in the development of our programme and the continuation of it. So we really kind of explore this idea of examinations, maybe having some limitations, particularly high-stake examinations, because our arts programme is a strand of sociology and a strand of politics. And we don't expect people to write a report in 2 hours. We don't expect people to, draw completely from their memory. We expect people to use learning from a range of different sources, to consult a range of different sources, to develop that argument. And often, as again, we saw earlier, that confined time limit, even the space, the environment, the context is removed from our disciplines of sociology and politics, because you don't go and sit in a room, 5 meters away from someone else and write something. And again, handwritten is so far again removed from our discipline. So we really focused on continuous assessment and looking at how it can be very much connected in with our disciplines, connected in with employability, again, real world, but also looking at the transfer of knowledge and skills, some of the core components of what we want to do within our arts programme. Also as well, again, we're all working from UDL principles, and it's something that's very much embedded in our programme. So the focus on relevance, value and authenticity. So we would spend a lot of time, I suppose, when we're introducing our assessments, talking to our students about why we're doing this. Not just because this is how you get your degree and you walk out the door and happy days, but actually how will you use this when the degree is over? So what is the value in these skills? Will an employer look for these skills? How can you go into an interview and explain the transfer of some of those knowledge and skills and your ability to actually use those? The authenticity side of it is very much, again, we would use a lot of case studies, a lot of drawing on students' own learning and own lives. So my discipline would be sociology. So we would use a lot of reflect on this in your own life. Where do you see this happening in the social world around you? So drawing from the students' own experiences and embedding that within our assessments.
So very briefly, as we were developing authentic assessment across our programme, one of the things that we did was that we wanted to refer back to industry. So thinking about Ajawi and colleagues' principles of authentic assessment, employability is one of those, assessment as and for learning is one of those. So we wanted to refer not only to our own expertise within the department, looking at our own and colleagues' ideas around what would constitute authentic assessment, but also to refer to industry and stakeholders. So we had the opportunity as part of programmatic review last year and the year before to check in with stakeholders from industry. So we had a focus group that would have included people from academia, from the diversity and inclusion sector, from NGOs, and what was the other one? I can't remember. But yeah, so sectors that our students would and our graduates would engage with as graduates. So we asked them what kind of skills they might need in terms of employability. So, you know, you would expect things like communication skills, advocacy skills, collaboration, ability to build relationships with people from a wide range of backgrounds, because as Maura said, our graduates could be employed in a wide range of sectors, anything from local government, European government, to NGOs, to work in community, local government, and so on. So apart from that relationship building and those kind of measurable skills, our stakeholders were looking at students' capacities for, orientations towards social issues and political issues. So things like commitments, actual commitments to inclusion, anti-racism and sustainability, and an ability to apply that in the workplace. And then knowledges, working knowledge of policy, engagement with social issues, and then again, those skills that you would expect, like quantitative and qualitative research skills, analytical skills, and report writing. So those are the kinds of areas that we tried to embed when we were designing authentic assessment and feedback practices across our programme. So sociology and politics, as Naomi said, designing assessments is very discipline specific. And for us, we weren't able to find that many examples out there, but we looked at what we already had and looked at designing, developing, and refining what we already had, and applying these principles of authentic assessment and feedback to our programme and to modules within it. So what we're going to do now is, as Maura said, give you a flavour of some of that, and hopefully, that would be useful to see how these principles have been applied to a specific programme.
So I'm going to take us through authentic feedback practices, and I suppose this is something that can actually often be overlooked. We talk about assessment, and as Naomi said earlier as well, we often overlook the feedback component, or we think about it after, or we think about it as often a tick the box exercise, or we think, oh, students don't come for feedback. So we really thought about how can we make this more of a collaborative approach. So this is one of the examples that has achieved some elements, maybe not all, it's still a work in progress. So I take the students in second year, so it's a 3-year degree, so I have the students in second year for a module called Understanding Sociological Research. This module is in second year. In third year, we have a module on research methods, and then in the following semester, they do a dissertation. So we've tried to ensure quite a scaffold approach within this. So one of the assessments is a literature review, which is obviously very much part of any research report that students are required to write. So it's preparing students as well for what's coming in the future with regard to their dissertation. Within this, I introduce students to what literature reviews are and the skills required in it. Part of that then is, we've built in tutorials that can help students develop the skills required for completing their literature review. One of the things that is embedded within this assessment is that students are asked to submit a draft. But within that draft, prior to actually submitting that draft, we have a tutorial where within that we take a sample literature review. We look at the criteria or the rubric that has been developed for the assessment. We develop questions from the rubric. So have they used reliable sources? Have they engaged, have they engaged in critical analysis? Have they compared and contrasted different literature sources? So we develop questions from the rubric. So students are developing maybe that, assessment literacy or that criteria literacy. And then we look at a sample literature review. And then the students, supported by myself, assess this sample literature review. So it's something that it's quite objective. It feels maybe in some ways less personal. So it's a safe space where students can assess a piece of work and think about someone's performance and maybe reflect on their own then with regard to what, assessment, the criteria, how do you apply that criteria? After that, then, we look at a good literature review. We look at something that has done it very, very well. So again, students are, what's happening in those tutorials leading up to their draft literature review is that assessment as learning, is that they're really developing those skills that are required. So then they submit their draft literature review. At the end of their submission, they actually engage in an assessment of their own work. So again, they use the rubric now, but for their own work. So they can say, Maura, I think I did this really well. This is an area I need to work on. I need to put a little bit more time into this. And that has really supported the process. And we'll see some of the comments from the students based on that process. So that's maybe, and again, maybe going back to Naomi's work, but maybe that's some of the assessment phase or the preparation phase is where the students are developing the skills. And there's a constant kind of within the tutorials, that space for me to constantly give feedback, but also for other students to feed in as well, particularly when we review the sample literature, because, Sinéad and I might argue, well, I think that's good versus I think it's excellent. And then we have to justify our decisions why based on the criteria. With regard then to the draft literature review, the students get some annotated feedback, using Turnitin. I'll show a sample of that in a minute. But in particular, I suppose I focus on the concept of dialogical feedback. So you'll see in a lot of my comments is that I'm trying to make it more active so the students can engage actively. So I tell them about maybe my process of engaging with this. So I read this and I missed this element, but I really understood this element. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or I ask questions, maybe saying, what more could you do in this area? Or how could you address this? In particular, what I really like about that component is that I can draw on the student's own evaluation. So you pointed out that this is an area you struggle with, and I can see where it's going right for you. I can see as well maybe we need to draw on these resources to assist you in this. So it very much does become that conversational element of that I'm drawing on what you said, maybe here's what I have to say about it. Then they get their feedback, we have opportunity to discuss in class. So again, we have that collaboration element. And built into that again is the feed forward component. So I suppose the formative is on the draft, and then there's some comments and a feedback coming from me that's focused on future orientation. So in your resubmission of this, or in your submission of your final draft, maybe you need to go to the Academic Writing Centre. Maybe you need to review or look at again what reliable sources you're using. Maybe you need to compare and contrast literature sources more, or maybe you need to focus on looking at thematic presentation. So looking at, these are the areas you can work on for your future submission. And that works then with the draft, and then obviously then students come along and hopefully we can have a conversation, but engage with that feedback and use it in their final submission. And then I go through that process again, actually with the final submission, where it becomes that dialogical nature of that. I can see you really worked on this. It's worked well for you in this instance, or I can see the effort that went into this, and you're rewarded as a result of that. And also as well then thinking about the feed forward and looking at their future research modules. So their dissertation, this will really assist you in writing your literature review for your dissertation, or think about working on developing these skills prior to taking on your dissertation. And they would be the components of the kind of the future relevance and feed forward. I suppose it's not something we constantly say, or that word it's only something that we don't really think about, but feedback and feed forward are often used in the same context. So here's some annotated feedback. So, you know, there's those little comment bubbles. So it's on the assessment and it's kind of scattered throughout. I think sometimes if you get a generic, just one comment, it's very hard sometimes for students, particularly these are second year students, it's very hard to know what part of the assessment was Maire actually referring to. So having those comments can actually fit very well because you can see each section that it's actually applying to. So, you know, you can see maybe some of the dialogue coming through there. So I can see the intention of your introduction is to inform the reader about the purpose of the content of the assignment. I found myself wondering about the literature searches you undertook for this literature review. How could you address this moving forward? So my active engagement and their active engagement, and then some kind of, you know, that feed forward of also consult the brief and think about the role the brief plays here. So again, directing them back to, you've been given a brief, the brief is asking you to set out how you used the library, what sources you utilized. So ensure that when you're doing your assessment that you're using those elements of the brief. Here are just some other comments that take on maybe the dialogical nature, the active nature, the active engagement and the feed forward. So here you have indicated the gap that age plays a role in this. How could you develop this point in order to further understandings of how age interacts with the performance of genders? Consider how further reading will support you in the development will support you in the full development of assignments. And other comments, it's good to see that you are setting out the study details. I see from your own evaluation that you would like to be more concise. Consider setting out the methodology, location and focus of the study in one sentence and then refer to the specific findings. So you can see there it's so beneficial to draw from the students' own comments because then it is something that's active. It's something that you're bringing this to my attention. I'm providing a possible solution as opposed to saying you're getting this wrong, because obviously we know that that's not the intention, nor should it be the intention behind feedback. And then the other comment, this article is relevant to your research question. I am, however, left wondering about the type of research that was carried out as I read about the findings. Knowing the methodology and methods used in the first place can help me determine the strength of the findings. How could you improve the structure of this in your final submission? In all of your assessments, think about the presentation and structuring of the information can assist both you and the reader. So again, you can see maybe the value and the relevance of that feedback coming through that hopefully would support a student in their final submission. And then just my last contribution to this is looking at how did the students experience this. It's a small sample of feedback coming through, but certainly I saw some strengths from this practice that the students felt worked well for them. So one of the questions was, overall, what are your thoughts on the process of assessing your strengths and areas of improvement in light of the marking criteria? So one of the students says it's very beneficial to the student. It's important to have a third person perspective on your work and able to step back from it and pretend to be someone else reading the assignment to see the gaps in your own work. So that's, you know, that objective, students learning to be objective in their work, taking the criteria and trying to assess it and maybe remove their own personal self from that. Someone else said, as I said previously, I feel as though engaging in the self-assessment section allowed me to develop an awareness which can be used within any assignment. So, you know, self-awareness, assessment skills, and also application to other assignments coming through. And then someone else thought it was a good idea. And then asking the students, do you think the feedback on your draft will help you in future assignments? And one student said it can be applied across the board regarding feedback of the structure of the assignment. Being able to analyse your own work for flaws and overall this learning is going to be essential to our dissertations in which a literature review is carried out. So you can see the students see the connection. They see that this assignment, this feedback will really help me in third year. Someone else said, yes, I've been given direction on where to go on any ideas that I need improvement in. And finally, it helped me connect my articles into themes instead of using them separately. So some of maybe the core skills that are required in a literature review, a student saying the feedback really helped me actually consolidate that. So that's, I suppose, just a whirlwind through an assessment that I developed and the feedback component of it coming from an authentic perspective. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague now, Sinead on her assessment practice.
Okay, just another example of some of the interesting assessments that we do. And I must thank Susan and Maire have been obviously working on this project for quite a while, and they've just co-opted me in the last couple of weeks to particularly demonstrate this assessment that we do. And I have to say, when we were talking about it, I was saying to them how validating it is to realise I've actually been at the cutting edge. I didn't know that I was doing authentic assessment, all right? So, and at this time of the year when we're all exhausted, I was like, oh my gosh, yay, I'm obviously getting something right. But I think, you know, I suppose acknowledging the fact that some of us are doing this in our practices without realising what it is that we're doing. One of the key drivers for me when I develop assessment, and it would have influenced this as well, is always thinking of myself as a graduate. You know, coming out of a 4-year undergraduate arts degree and thinking, I know lots and I can do nothing, you know? And I can remember that £10 ticket, which was the boat and the bus to London. And that's what we did, you know, in the mid-90s. And that sense of, I can't believe I've done 4 years and I cannot see, or I have no ability to relate what it is that I've done over those 4 years to what I now need to do to basically earn an income for myself, you know. Now, of course, once I started going within the workforce, I realized, yes, actually I do, but it took me the year or two. And if I'd had some of these type of assessments built into my work, do you imagine the confidence that you would have had? You would have hit the ground running when you'd actually come out. So that's something that has always influenced how I would approach the development of an assessment without realizing it was called authentic assessment. Right? So, you know, real world skills, always looking at, you know, what in this assessment is transferable and what is that they can actually do with this themselves, and also, you know, develop their own identity. So as I say, when I realized this is what I'm doing, I started looking at some of the principles and that idea of collaborating with stakeholders. Now, when I first developed this about 5 years ago, this particular module, as part of the BA Arts program, we would have done a number of focus groups. And one of them I would have done with a number of people working in the community sector. And one of the key things they were saying to me, you know, all of the funding applications we need to do now, grant applications, we need to, you know, we need to have a build up of a profile of our area. That's to hand, that we can say, here's the data. This is why we're disadvantaged. This is why you need to give us money. And, you know, they were describing to me just that as a bulk of work that actually had to be done. And saying it'd be really handy if your students knew how to do that. And of course, they were actually really looking for students to come out and do placement and possibly do some of this work for them, you know. But I had thought, we don't address this within the degree program. So that was, you know, one key thing. I thought, the development of community profile. How great is that for a student to be able to go out and say, you know, in an employment setting, they do an active politics module with us as well, where they go out and they work with various organisations, and to be able to then say, listen, I can put this data together for you. I know how to actually do this, so I can be of use. The key thing, developing those employability skills, you know, being able to read data, being able to put stats together, you know, because this is particularly, there's a quantitative approach used within this assessment, being able to read graphs, relate them to each other, understanding the difference between data and knowledge. And then a key part of, if you're doing a grant application, is how do I actually construct a message out of this data, a message that supports what it is that I'm actually trying to get out of this situation, you know. Now the subject, student choice within it as well, because they get to choose, you know, where do you want to do your community profile? And invariably they do it where they're from, all right? Sometimes some will do it if they've been living in Sligo a couple of years, they might do it on Sligo, but invariably people go back to actually where they're from. So they're selecting the geographical area that they're going to do it on. Also within the assessment, there's a general geographical profile piece that they do, but then they also select a theme. So they might look at employment within that particular area, they might look at education within that particular area, or they might select maybe a vulnerable group within that area. So again, they're deciding what's the theme that's standing out for them, and they'll go and they'll explore that a little bit further within the assessment, you know. Key for me, you know, there's a real world product at the end of it. They have a community profile. 2 years ago, actually, one of the students, it was exemplary, the piece of work that she did. And she gave that, her assessment, she gave it to one of the local community projects and they were able to use it. And honestly, the confidence boost that she got as an individual to read, to validate the work that she'd done, and to realise, you know, she didn't actually get paid for it, unfortunately. But, you know, I was able to tell her how much that would have cost for somebody to actually put that forward. And of course, the group were delighted to get it. So that was a real, you know, for me to see that kind of confidence that she got out of that, knowing, you know, I've got a skill set here, I can go out and I can sell, you know. Now, the feedback piece, what I've been, how is it that I've inculcated feedback within it? I mean, one of the fortunate things with this particular group, it's a very, very small group. And what I've done is I've scheduled in, we have 3 hours on the timetable every week, and I've scheduled in one of those hours within a lab, within a computer lab. So in actual fact, my feedback is very much based on that dialogical, but also that relationship piece. I am essentially mentoring them. From kind of week 3 or week 4, we are working on this profile together. So I will demonstrate, let's go in, let's look at, you know, the deprivation index in Pubble Maps or whatever, and then everybody is sitting on their PC. And everybody's exploring it together. And I'm literally going around to each individual and seeing where they're at. Can they even access the maps? Right? You know, even that is funny itself. Trying to be able to read a map, you know, trying to be able to understand the boundaries. And I'll just look at some of those photographs as well and show you what it is that they do. But that mentoring approach is essential for them to build their confidence in, you know, working with web pages and programs that they wouldn't be used to, and of course working with stats and data that they wouldn't be used to as well. It's been a real eye-opener for me where people are coming from secondary school and actually quite limited ability to interpret data, to interpret statistics, to interpret relativity between statistics, and, you know, what do these things actually mean. So as I say, that it is a mentoring approach that I take, which provides the student with the feedback. So what are the components of this particular community profile? Okay, firstly, an introduction to the chosen area. And what I like with what some of the students do here, they they tend to give me a picture of what their idea of what the area is. So it's very, you can already see how it is that they identify their place. And it's been very interesting in some of the feedback that the students have said, actually, I started to think differently about where I'm from, just as, you know, sitting down and actually researching it. I asked them then to look at Pubble Maps to get a sense of what's that socioeconomic index. So for those of you who be in any way familiar with that, we've got a deprivation index, and from that deprivation index is decided where your deaf schools go, who gets funding for X, Y, and Z. So they're actually really, really important. What I teach the students to do is, how do we work with this software? So how do we go into Pubble Maps? How do we decide on the different boundaries that we're selecting? Are we looking at it at county level? Are we looking at it at electoral division level? Or even at what we would call the small area population level? Now, you can imagine in the Northwest dealing with some of the rural communities, I've had some people go in and look at the small area population level, but that's my neighbour. As we say, you know, the 7 people who ticked the Asian box, and, you know, I think it was Claire Morris or somewhere anyway, those are my neighbours, you know. So you've got to be a bit careful with how that identity works within a rural context. So they're learning a lot there around that. And I'll keep that point to later, but I'll make a further point about that socioeconomic index and looking at the work that Public do. They're also learning, of course, how do I access a lot of research that's actually out there and start to get comfortable with that. Then, of course, we go to the CSO data. And anyone who's familiar with that, you'll see the CSO data is, you know, presented just as numbers. So they get very excited when they realize it's been really easy to find the numbers. And then I go, yeah, only the beginning of it, guys. Right, so we need the numbers, but how does the data become a piece of knowledge? And then how does it become a message that actually supports maybe a funding application? Or, you know, a particular message that your particular community group wants to send out there to the world. So we're looking at the CSO, we're doing general population, general kind of demographics, but then we'll also do, as I said, that theme study. So they'll go in and they'll look at specifically maybe education within that geographical area, maybe look at, you know, vulnerable groups within that geographical area, or the economy. And that's very much, they're deciding that themselves. So you get very interesting insight from students. I didn't realize everyone commuted. And I said, well, you're not there 9 to 5 either, so you don't realize how empty the place is. You know, there's lots of different things that they're picking up from looking at that theme study. There's also a section where we're looking at what are local government doing there? What are local development agencies doing there? So they're going on to, you know, myplan.ie, they're going on to local county council websites, and again, learning, how do I read a development plan? Now, we would, as part of this module, also attend local government meetings. So they're learning to interact with the local development plans, but also learning to see that political process that happens within local government meetings. So they will allude to some of that within this assignment as well. And then the final piece that they do as part of it, because this is very quantitative to date. And I've always said to them, it's really important for them to develop that set of quantitative skills and that data set. But that needs to be balanced out with something that's qualitative as well. And so what they do is they go out and they speak to a community representative. Now, from an ethical perspective, that person has to be someone who's either in a professional working capacity or somebody who is on the board of a community organisation or somebody who is in an elected representative or somebody who's in local government. But what they're doing is, and we develop a set of questions together, is to get a sense of what is it actually like to live in this community. So I've got what the numbers are telling me and the picture that they've built up, the objective picture. Now let's see, what does it feel like? What's the subjective picture? And it can be really interesting for the students that, you know, sometimes an area can come out, I hate the term, deprived, you know, from the quantitative data. And then they go and they meet somebody who's working within the community group. And the plans are fascinating for what it is that they're intending to do. And the data is not reflective of where it is that people are actually at. So that's a real learning piece for the students as well. There's also, of course, going out, you know, contacting somebody to arrange an interview, developing the questions, going out and actually running the interview, and then coming back and themizing the responses to that. And then, of course, they're collating all of that. They have to present those then as findings to the class, and then facilitate a discussion afterwards around some of the recommendations that they have come up with. So it's no mean feat. It is, you know, it is quite a piece of work that they do. So I just wanted to throw some of the introductions to the area, and I really like how some people, they put pictures together, they illustrate this piece quite a bit. So you get a lot of the maps, this sense of thinking, oh, community profile is something physical. But then you'll also see if there's a new piece of infrastructure or a new building, people really connect with that as well. So you'll always see a picture, if there was a bright, shiny building put up in the last 5 years or so, like, yeah, whack bang, that gets up in a picture as well. So pick some of these particularly. Ballymote apparently developed, you know, the guy who founded Celtic Football Club came from Ballymote, which I didn't know. So again, what's the symbol of my area? What's an identity of my area that I hadn't necessarily thought of before? I like that that's the Foxford Woolen Mills, for anyone who's familiar with Foxford, and just that, looking at those changes over times, and again, using the picture to display that. Tubbercurry has become all sexy since they started filming normal people there. So I couldn't, you know, this is what the students' work was this year. They've given me permission to show them, and I just thought, you know, whole new identity for anyone coming from Tubbercurry, which was never considered a sexy area until a few years ago. Tubber? Oh, right, yeah. Well, it's totally hip now, so it is, you know. So just, for those of you who wouldn't be as familiar with some of the databases that we would use, so this is Pobble Maps. So what, you know, we're looking for the deprivation index. This is the Trude Haze Deprivation Index that was developed about 15, 20 years ago. It's used by a variety of government bodies to basically categorize where it is that we are. Are we, you know, are we in an affluent area? Are we marginally above advantage? Or, you know, are we just average? Or are we disadvantaged or significantly disadvantaged? You know, so we can see what we're doing is we go into the area, and then we get a sense of where are we categorized, marginally below. So, and what key thing that we're looking for is, are there any changes over that time? And, you know, what's interesting is I'll get people to look at that, but I'll also get them to look at maybe the small area that's actually just next door, which is maybe the next neighboring streets or something like that, which can be quite different, which is very interesting within an urban frame for them to see the difference that happens within a couple of streets. And then for them to even reflect, because in one particular case, we actually went to a particular area, a housing estate within a town, which was extremely, you know, disadvantaged on the Trude Haze Index. And then we walked around, and they had actually had a particular community project there the week before. So all the flower boxes were out. The place looked fabulous. And of course, my students were, what? You know, how can this be, you know, that this place is coming up as severely disadvantaged, and led them to do their own research as to what are the indicators that are used to develop this category, and to start to question that all of the metrics that are used are economic metrics. They're not in any way, there's nothing there about well-being. There's nothing there about quality of life, you know. So, you know, they've had that opportunity to really question the data bank that we use to develop pictures of, you know, of a particular place. So that was very interesting. And they subsequently went off to speak with somebody who was working with that community organisation to find it's a really exciting place to live in. It doesn't look like that, you know, if you were just looking at the quantitative data. And of course, we learn, you know, the layer list there, so we learn to find, you know, at different levels, how do we access? Again, if you're familiar with CSO just comes up like this, so you've got numbers. So you need to work with numbers. Now that was an eye-opener for me to realise they're coming out of secondary school, guys, without any sense of percentages. It was quite incredible because people felt the first year I did it, what was happening was people were giving me numbers and tables. And I thought, it doesn't mean anything. And it was only until it was expressed as a percentage or expressed in relative terms that in actual fact it became a piece of knowledge. So that's really interesting for the students as well to see that difference between just data and knowledge. What I realized then, and that's why a lot of the mentoring came in, and I booked the computer lab and have it for an hour every week, was because I thought I have to sit down and actually do that with them. So as I said, very quickly we learned how to calculate percentages, and we learned how to, if it's going to be a piece of knowledge and it's going to be a message, we need to express it at a relative level. So that's what we taught the students. And again, hadn't thought when I was developing this module that I would need to go back and do some basic maths with students, but to actually be able to help them to achieve this, we had to do that. And people have really actually enjoyed it, and you'll see some of the comments at the end. Then, of course, bringing it that step forward, how do we make it visual? Because that's really what's going to attract people when they open it up. So we you know, looked at compiling graphs, compiling pie charts, and just again, seeing that relative and how I get a message from seeing something presented at a relative level. Then again, as I said, what we do then is, you know, we like to do something qualitative. So they're going out, they're chatting to a community representatives, and they're really getting the opportunity to see the subjective experience versus the objective experience. So it's really giving them an opportunity to analyze, and particularly what we're getting out of it is we're measuring everything at an economic level. We're not measuring, you know, social well-being in any way. So that's always been an interesting conclusion that the students arrive at. So just 2 days ago, I asked some of the students, I said, you know, I'm going to talk to some people about this assessment, and I've always had a lot of, you know, positive feedback from the students themselves. So I said, can you give us a few lines on how you feel you got on with the assessment? So you can see there.
Thanks, Sinead. So I'll jump in here. So some of you will have heard me talk about this assessment before when it was at development stage. It's the Sustainable Campus Mapping Assessment. So interesting to see the link in with mapping in Sinead's presentation there. So this assessment example comes from a module called Technology, Climate and Society. And I've adapted the assessment from Shuite, who's written this fabulous book that I recommend on creative universities. And so I think some of what she talks about around critical creative pedagogy has resonance with some of the principles of, for example, authentic assessment and UDL. So she talks about whole person learning that's embodied and emotional components embedded. And also this idea of radical hope and imagining, and I kind of like that link with the overarching theme of this project. So that idea that even within kind of neoliberal context that we can be reimagining futures, that we can kind of have radical hope and look at possibilities. So particularly when we're looking at really intransigent and difficult social issues, so something around climate change, how can we think differently around this? So with this assessment, the aim is to give students opportunities to reimagine things and to observe their environments, to analyze their environments, and to look within their environments for examples of like who is excluded, what are the interactions between environment and humans, as well as kind of those very practical and technological changes that are needed. So what I've tried to embed within the design of the assessment are those principles of authentic assessment coming from Ajawi and colleagues. So assessment as learning, so students are learning as they're undertaking this kind of project-based piece of assessment, that it is related to employment skills that employers are looking for, but that it's also enjoyable and creative, embodies critical thinking and those UDL principles. So there's choice definitely embedded within this. It links the theory that they're undertaking in class, that they're doing reading around this area. And also, as you'll see as I go along, it requires all of those kind of ABC learning types that Diane Lowrilow talks about. So everything from discussion, collaboration, acquisition, to production, for example. So there are a few components in it. So these are overall the steps of the assignment. So it's mapping their own campus, mapping the campus of ATU Sligo, and looking to see what is sustainable within it, what are the sites of sustainability, and what needs to change. And you know, employing that idea of radical hope, linking that with the theoretical material that they've read. So the theoretical material is coming from, first of all, science, technology and society. So writers like Latour and Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, and kind of the more practice-based everyday evidence that's coming to us on climate change. So some of the writing, even, you know, from Indigenous people, for example, and linking all of that together with their observations, measurements, and conversations around campus. So first of all, it's reading, discussing the roles of infrastructures in a general sense, looking at the academic literature on the importance of socio-technical systems such as food, water, transport, and energy in human lives, but also non-human lives, and the interaction with the ecology of the planet. So once they kind of have that background knowledge, they're moving into this assessment as learning, where they're doing their own inquiries. So similar to what Sinéad is talking about, they're researching and familiarising themselves with campus infrastructures. And what we've built in is a really strong relationship with the Green Campus Initiative at ATU Sligo. So we've had a lot of support from our sustainability officer, Fiona Britton, who's been able to fill in some of the gaps that, you know, I wouldn't be specialised in, that students wouldn't necessarily have knowledge of. So we're working in collaboration with Fiona. I'll just say a bit more about that in a moment. Then as part of the assessment, I ask students, this is a group assessment, so they walk around the campus, they physically engage with the campus, they look for particular points of interest, they take photographs, and they look for evidence of sustainability, whether that's in terms of the technologies that are employed, or whether it's about, like, you know, whose knowledge is included here, who is excluded here. So if you're looking at something like transport, for example, like how does that interact with people who have disabilities? You know, how are they included and how is this sustainable for every group of people? And also non-humans, like where's the evidence of interaction with the environment, with insects or, you know, with animals in any way? So what's happening? So they're really integrating a wide range of really complex knowledges with practical observations. So then they're asked to create some kind of map and annotate that and come up with their own ideas for innovation. So this is the step. So this, I try to make this a very scaffolded experience. So students, first of all, come up with their plan, and this year they had the opportunity to sort of pitch and talk about what they were planning to do prior to actually doing it. So they were able to discuss it with their peers, with myself, and with Fiona Britton. And so there was that kind of feedback coming from peers, lecturers, and others. So we were able to maybe advise them on other things that they might look at, other things that they might consider. So there was that kind of formative feedback before they actually were undertaking the main part of the assessment. So the kinds of questions that were scaffolding their inquiry were actually observing the infrastructures, how were people interacting with them, were they sustainable, were the connections with the natural habitat, any signs of inequity, for example, around gender, race, or disability, any values, like what assumptions were made in the design of the infrastructures, and then to propose some improvements and make their map, present that in class. So I was really struck by the outcomes from this assessment. I was really delighted with student engagement, their enjoyment, and sort of the pride and the depth that they went into this assignment with. So, for example, on the food theme, I had students who engaged with kitchen staff, talked to them about how they sourced food, what foods were prepared, what was available, what kinds of food were served, like in terms of halal options, in terms of vegan options. And, you know, some of the recommendations were amazing. And I particularly liked one of them that was around incentivizing meat-free options. So, you know, clearly there's a need to move towards more meat-free diets, you know, for a sustainable planet. But they were thinking, like, within the campus, could that be incentivized? Because currently meat-free options are quite expensive, students don't tend to go for them. So how about incentivizing that? So I thought that was quite an innovative suggestion. On the energy theme, again, all of these were learning from me. I suppose that's what was really interesting. I loved the insight of one group of students around energy when they talked about the impact of artificial light, especially in institutions and large buildings, on plant and animal behaviour. So as somebody from a non-scientific background, that was really interesting to me. And also the impact of lighting within our buildings, particularly for people who have sensory issues. So again, they had really interesting recommendations. And one of those was prioritising the use of natural light, and something that they pointed out, which was really obvious, but that we had a lot of great kind of glass features on the building, but yet there was artificial light in place all of the time. So it was really interesting and, a very practical solution that they suggested, among other recommendations. And on the transport theme, we had students who did a really in-depth survey of bus stops and walkable routes around the campus, and looking at how accessible they were for everybody, how accessible information on bus timetables was, and all of these innovative ideas around things like, could there be pollination centres around these bus stops? Could there be, habitats for bees or other insects? Could there be areas for rainwater collection? And that was garnered from their research of contexts of other countries. So again, some really innovative and engaged ideas coming from that. And so in terms of feedback, so Maire and Sinéad have talked about student feedback to lecturers, lecturer feedback to students. I have a little bit of feedback from an external examiner who I didn't ask to say this, but who said that they found that these observations on campus were illustrating reality and consequences of practices on campus. And interestingly saying that it demonstrates a high level of initiative and real-world research skills and desk-based researchability. So I thought, yes, that was exactly what I was going for. And so then on an ongoing basis, we're hoping to continue the relationship with the Green Campus Initiative. We're planning to engage with a conference at ATU Sligo during the summer on sustainability, because we're trying to embed across the campus sustainability within education, and Karina mentioned it earlier as well. We also have a new project starting where we're hoping to have training and capacity building opportunities for staff within social sciences to embed sustainability within various modules. So this is something that we hope will grow and continue. So that's me. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, ladies. We'll just take if there is a question from, is there a question online, or I think Rita has, do you have your hand up, Rita? Yeah, thanks, Rita. Excellent, ladies, really innovative, very authentic, real world examples. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, exactly. It was a really lovely presentation, really interesting. I've learned a lot about sociology and politics as a subject. I dismissed it a long time ago when I was going for science and my sister was going for arts at the same time. And I've actually loads of questions prompted by your presentation. It was so interesting. One is, what's the deprivation index in Tubbercurry now after we've had normal people? But genuinely, the question I think is for Sinead. Is that you, Sinead? Sorry, then the question is for Maura. When you were talking about feed forward in terms of feedback, I was wondering, because it's something that even though I came from industry in the local medtech industry, and a lot of what we would have done would be produce reports and other artifacts that would go through multiple loops of collaboration, feedback, all of that. So in my first year, when I didn't do anything like that with my students, I was kind of disappointed in myself, I suppose, at my approach. And in subsequent years then, I got my students to create a draft. We would have some discussion. I didn't do it formally, we'd have some discussion, more like a workshop. Come to me with what you've got, but their deadline for submission would be a couple of weeks' time. So again, having listened this morning, I want to embed that. So sorry, I'm getting to the question. What I wondered, based on your presentation, Maura, was would you allow some of the grades for the assignment for the draft, some for the engagement in the feedback process, and some for the final product? Or are all the marks for the final product?
In this one, I probably don't need it anyways, but so this is a second year module. I actually have the students in first year as well, and I do that exact approach where for a draft, there is feedback given, and in the final submission, they have the opportunity, there's marks actually going for the application of the feedback. As a result of me doing that in first year, I don't actually do it in second year because I want the students to self-regulate. I want them to take on some autonomy in that, knowing that the reason we did it in first year was I actually benefited from it. I gained from it. So whilst it might not be explicit in that you took on the feedback, so there isn't an explicit mark for taking on feedback, it actually automatically improves your work by taking on the feedback. So I certainly have it in my approach, but not in that specific. And I think your point actually about, you know, the informal feedback, that's as much feedback as it is in any sense, in that students having the opportunity, maybe informally, because I think sometimes the formal nature of it can be quite fearful for students, that if it's, we're having a chat, we're discussing where you're at, it's looking at your progress. I think that's actually a really beneficial approach, and I do it myself sometimes.
What I found with that is that the top students will engage really well and bring a highly crafted draft to those sessions, and the students that perhaps needed more help or support or a lift were not. That's where I kind of thought, if I could craft it, that there was even a small portion of the marks for the draft. Yeah. Level of effort. And then, yeah, it's just food for thought. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I suppose it depends. You can think about your rubric, because often we give marks for like presentation and organisation, but you could build it in there as well. So it is a component of it that would encourage and maybe help students where their effort is, you can see the effort and you're trying to encourage it further. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Trish, yeah, I'll just take one more.
Maura and everyone, that's a really good presentation. My question to Maura is this: I really like your examples of feedback to your students, but I think a lot of my good students who take what you say and run with it, I'm wondering about the less able students and whether or not putting questions like, how do you think you can improve, works, as opposed to you need to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I would balance it, I suppose. It's, you know, and again, because we have a smaller group, often we would know the students that where those students can take on that type of feedback of how do you think you could do this? You need to go that step further. How might we do that? And then there is those, I suppose it actually, some of what Naomi talked about as well, where you go from the abstract, you go from the detailed specific comments to the more strategy based. So often I would say to a student, you need to look at, or you need to consult your previous module on these skills. So we would have a module, let's say, on study and research skills. So I would often say, you need to go back to lecture 5, or you need to go back to that guide that you had from that module and look at how you can assess, let's say, the reliability of a source. So maybe it's providing them with the resource and saying, this is where you need to go to develop that strategy to improve your work in that area. So it's probably a balanced approach. Certainly, I do understand that maybe sometimes the question, it's nearly leaving it too much in the students, in their lap maybe, and without kind of being left without that support. So trying to balance that would be, yeah, and it's certainly, again, because we have a smaller group of students, it's something that's possible. Whereas if we had a huge group of students, it would be much more difficult. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks very much. Is that it? We're going to take a break now, but thanks a million, ladies. That was great. Really 3 excellent examples from Sligo. So thank you. So we're going to take 10 minutes.